I think it's actually a very significant event and announcement, because I don't think a lot of those people will know what Polyspectra has achieved and the significance of it. I think it's one of the most significant developments in additive manufacturing in the history of additive manufacturing, and definitely in the history of stereolithography. And I just want to ask you a few questions out of genuine interest and fascination with what you've achieved. I guess I want to ask, the first question is, who is Robert Grubbs?
Okay, but yeah, well, the answer to that question is Bob Grubbs. So everyone calls him Bob. So yeah, Bob Grubbs is one of my two PhD advisors at Caltech, where I did my PhD in chemistry, and is also yeah, someone I've actually known him my whole life, because I actually grew up pretty close to Caltech, and so he's uh, he is most well known for winning the 2005 Nobel Prize for a reaction called olefin metathesis, and specifically a set of ruthenium catalysts that many people refer to as the Grubbs catalyst. So in synthetic chemistry, it's very common for people to, as shorthand, they sort of name molecules after the person who publishes them originally. So, other people in the literature who are using his catalyst just started calling it Grubbs catalyst instead of having to, type out the 100-character chemical name. And so, yeah, so he was my PhD advisor, and what Polyspectra has actually developed is basically the light activated variation of what you'd call the Grubbs catalyst. So the original Grubbs catalyst, you add it to the reaction, it starts going. And for example, you can use that to make really high performance thermosets with reactive injection molding, or resin transfer, vacuum assisted resin transfer for carbon fiber composites. And what we've developed is the light activated version of that. And so we're taking that kind of chemistry to 3D printing and specifically stereolithography.
Sure. Now, winning a Nobel, they don't give out Nobel Prizes for trivial things. So
It's true.
the development of the Grubbs catalyst enabled some types of reaction that couldn't be easily achieved before. So could you just outline a little about the types of reactions that a Grubbs catalyst can achieve?
Yeah. So I guess at a super high level, it's used all over the place, but most people would not know about it. So every single pharmaceutical company in the world uses Grubbs catalyst as part of their drug discovery platforms. It's been used to make all kinds of specialty chemicals, and use seed oils, for example, as feedstocks. So creating chemicals from renewable starting materials. So taking seed oil, splitting it open, and using those two things for, let's say, one half of it could go into becoming a fuel, another half could become like a soap or a kind of specialty monomer chemical. The main thing that we use it for is a subset of the reaction is called ring opening metathesis polymerization. And there we're actually using it to make advanced materials. So polymerizing these strained ring olefins and using that to make really high performance durable materials.
Right, because probably a lot of users of stereolithography have heard of the material sets that are in use, and they're predominantly acrylate based and epoxy based.
Yeah.
But by and large, there are acrylate based chemistry, and there's an unfortunate limitation that acrylates that are formed typically from the light activated polymerization of acrylates don't really have very favorable properties. They're quite brittle, and or they're not as flexible as you'd like, and really limited.
Or if
And
they're
so
flexible, they have no tear strength. That's another one we see all the time.
around with a lot, and I've seen the good and the bad, and
Yeah.
there are some materials that perform at the upper range, but I think it's important to recognize that we're not dealing with acrylate chemistry here. We're dealing with a completely novel type of chemistry, a chemistry that didn't really, it wasn't really possible for the last couple of decades, and not available now in a light activated form until you came along.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the properties of the COR Alpha material that is based on this light.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll do a short version of it now, and we'll save some more quantitative version for when we dig in later. But yeah, I would say the sort of uh, strength and weakness of polyspectra is we're not using any of the same chemistry that's been a part of the the original 1983 invention of stereolithography, right? So we have a completely new mechanism. Olefin metathesis itself is really young. As far as chemical reactions go, it was really only in the 90s that it was discovered at all. And so in terms of global supply chains and finding its way into different applications, it's pretty young. And then in the context of 3D printing, it's extremely young. So that gives us the ability to do things that are literally impossible to do with acrylates. And we'll get more into the applications of this later, but I would say our most successful customers have tried everything. And we're really only focused on customers that, at least for the last few years, up until now, we've really tried to focus on customers that, like, it is absolutely impossible to manufacture what they're trying to manufacture with today's materials. And so, yeah, we'll go into some more later, but the key white space that we targeted with COR Alpha, so granted, remember, this is like a mechanism. So people talk about platform technologies. We could take this in so many different directions. We could do elastomers, we could do, filled materials that like composites. But we really wanted to start with tough and hot at the same time. So some people could do tough, some people could do hot, but as you mentioned before, most materials are really brittle and have really low working temperature. And if you think about it, every polymer product, every plastic product in your everyday life, you take for granted that it's not going to melt if you leave it in your car on a hot summer's day, and it's not going to break when you drop it on the floor. And that's unfortunately just not really true in 3D printing. I'm sure you and your team have cried many times after printing something beautiful and then letting it slip out of your hands onto the floor. We had the same experience. So we'll get quantitative with it later, but I think the main white space that we targeted with COR Alpha was a rigid polymer that would have what's called a ductile failure mode. So this high impact strength, high toughness, high chemical resistance, high heat resistance.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think the first time I became really aware, this is a few years ago, but I saw one of your videos where you threw a piece of material that you'd 3D printed in COR Alpha into a blender with other stereolithography parts, and you turn the blender on, and it's great because there's it's just a visual demonstration. You turn the blender on and everything's churned to chips, but the COR Alpha material survives the impacts from the blender at full speed. This is like a NutriBullet, and comes out intact, which is absolutely amazing. If anyone who has any experience with trying to 3D print materials that are tough, and they see that, then it becomes clear that there's something very special about the COR Alpha material.
Yeah, that was a really fun one, and without going into too many details, I will say that it immediately caught the attention of many folks, including people who were reaching out to ask whether or not it was their material that we had.
All right.